Today I'm going to show you how to make a custom pattern for a center seam stitched in shoe. And these are custom shoes, meaning that if you wanted to start a shoemaking business, you can make shoes for people whose feet are unusual or people who wear orthotics. We're going to use this very wide, very deep last for making our shoe. Two of the ways to make simple shoes are stitch downs and stitch ins. And stitch downs are much more common. This is an example of a stitch down, and that means that the upper turns out where it meets the sole, and then the stitching is seen here. And this leaves a raw edge of leather, but of course you expect the edge to be nicely sanded and smoothed. It's a cool way to make shoes, but the stitch in that you see here looks more like a fully lasted shoe. And you can see here that it's stitched in. So there's this small edge on the inside. Of course, this shoe is not a center seam, so you can do a stitch in with a full flat shoe by starting up at the toe and stitching for a few stitches in one direction and then a few stitches in the other direction, and keep going until you get back here where it's easier to do. But the easiest way to do a stitch in is to make a center seam, because you have this toe seam stitched last. So while you're stitching, this is all opened up and you can easily see where you're stitching. So you can see this one is turned under on conveyor belt sewing. And another thing is that you can line the top line of your shoes, and in this case, the center seam shoe, just for a little less stretching along the top line, but you can put the lining on the outside of the shoe and do something decorative with it. I drew around the sole of this last. In a real person, you would have toe marks up here as you drew around the foot. So when you do make a sole pattern for a human, smooth it out like this. Don't go into all the indentations where the toes are, and try to make a smooth line around the footprint. I've drawn these lines across the heel and the widest part of the foot, the ball of the foot, to find the center line in both of those so that I can find the center of the sole. And then draw a line here. You'll have a toe seam and you want it to end exactly in the center. When I measured the sole of this last, I got about 10 inches. So I went through the sole patterns and found that size 7 is about 10 inches, so that this might work for this foot. Of course, the last has toe space added in. So if I were you and I had a measurement of 10 inches for the length of my foot, I would probably use a size 8. I would make a size 8 mock-up, and then that will give you the information of whether that's the correct size for you. Since the last has toe space, I'm going to go with the 7, meaning that I'm going to cut out the upper patterns in size 7. So I've done that here. You can see that I have added an inch or so to the bottom edge. So we're making a mock-up first, a felt mock-up, and I want to have extra material in case this last needs more width. Certainly it's going to, since it's extra wide. So I cut out both of these, added this extra bit, and then I'll be cutting these two pieces out of felt. I'm finishing up cutting out the upper patterns, the inside and outside of the foot. The next step is to stitch these two pieces together at the heel seam and the toe seam. I stitched the heel seam, just a whip stitch, and I'm doing the same here. I don't have to try to get it lined up with stitch marks, so just whipping around, and then I'll be able to try it on the last. I arrived at the bottom of the seam, and I'll take the thread around my needle twice, pull it up, and make a knot there. I have my sole pattern with the center points marked on it, and I've cut this out of cardboard, and now I'm going to make the frame. So I've cut it out, and now I'll mark those center points on the frame. And I will make stitch marks around the edge of the frame. I'm going to start at the heel, and I'm putting a mark on both sides of the heel, and then I'm going around making more marks. Always holding the edge of this against the cutout sole, so I don't line it up with the previous line. I keep it on the edge of the sole. And I'm also going to do the same thing at the toe. So I'm going to put a stitch mark on both sides of the toe seam. Then this way, if there's one stitch or a few stitches that have to be a little bigger or a little smaller, it won't take place in these crucial areas. It'll be somewhere here or here where it's not noticeable. So I'll go for a while longer this way. And I'll go in this direction. I'll come back when these stitch marks get close together. The tab that I was using is 3/8 of an inch wide. As I approached the center of these two stitch marks, I made little dots, and I can see that it does not equal out that the stitch marks will be exact in here. I have 4 points, so I can either make 3 large stitches or 4 smaller ones, and I think I'm going to go for this 4 smaller ones. So that means this one goes a little bit here, this one goes here, and then the other 2. I made 3 stitch marks, and this space is just a little bit small, so I'll divide, just kind of eyeball, 1, 2, 3, and I have my sole with stitch marks all around it. So I'm ready to assemble the upper and this frame for making a mock-up. Here's the completed mock-up. I probably should have added more than just an inch around the bottom edge, since it is such a very wide shoe. The ball of the foot is extra wide, extra wide. But I did barely make it. You can see that around the toe area that I just barely got a little, it just barely reached down to the cardboard sole. But it's going to work. And a thing that I noticed is that I had to change the shape of the toe seam, that the one that I had there was kind of popped up from the last, and that's great. I made a mark with the permanent marker, and I'll be able to follow that line. Both, I made that mark on the inside and the outside of the foot, and so I'll be able to make a seam that just fits, that's customized for this foot. And if I wanted to make the top line lower, because it looks kind of high all over, that's no problem. And the heel might be a little high too, so just draw a line where you think you would like it, and of course you can change the shape of the top line. It could be rounded or squared off. So we have the custom pattern here, and I'm looking forward to making the actual shoe. I did decide to drop the top line all around, and especially lower at the point in the front. So we'll see how that works out. I've taken the felt upper off of the last and added a 1/4 inch to the bottom edge. And I have my stitch marks all ready to line up with the stitch marks on the sole. I had to undo the toe seam because you can't do a stitch in when you have the toe seam stitched. So I just undid that, and now I'm starting back at the heel and going in that first hole. On the upper and on the sole. When you do the actual leather upper, you would use a 2-needle running stitch, but here I don't need to do that while making a mock-up. I'm just going to do a running stitch. So I've gone down through the upper and then into the sole, and now I'm going back up through the sole and then through the next stitch mark on the upper. So I'll continue around here. Stitching one side of the mock-up in place. And I'll be back when I'm ready to stitch the other side. I've finished stitching the outside of the foot, And we'll now do the inside. So I go back to the heel and bring my needle through the felt piece, then the sole, down, and then up again into the next hole in both. And curve around here. And again, I'll be back when I reach the toe. I've finished stitching the inside of the shoe, and I just started on the toe seam. So as soon as I have this seam stitched up, I will be able to try the mock-up on the last. It's representing a foot, and we'll know if I need to make any more tweaks to the mock-up before I make the actual leather shoe. And let's check it out. Here's the mock-up over this pudgy last, and it looks like it's got a pretty good fit. Excellent, actually. So I will have no qualms about going ahead and making a center seam custom shoe out of leather. I have made my patterns, punched out the stitch holes just on one pattern for the heel and toe seams. Cut the top line down, 3 stitches off of the front and 2 off of the back on both pieces. And this isn't going to be a real shoe. The last that I'm using is so wide and so deep. I don't know anyone who has a foot shaped like that. But I do want to see the frame method and its results. So I cut the leather uppers out of more like the belly leather, not the best leather, and I'm making just a cardboard sole for the shoe. The first thing that I'm going to do now is to stitch the heel seam together. I have this heel seam stitched, and now I'm stitching the outside of the shoe to the sole. And if I were making a real shoe, I would be using a 2-needle running stitch and would be taking one thread down through the hole and the other thread up through the hole. But since this is just a model, I made a knot and am just doing a running stitch. But I'm turning this in. I'm turning the edge in as I go. So I'll just keep doing the running stitch until I get up here to the toe. I have stitched the outside of the shoe all the way up here to the center of the toe seam mark. And so I'm starting back at the heel. to stitch the inside of the shoe. So I'm doing the same running stitch, and I'll continue with this till I get to the toe again. I'm getting excited. The shoe's coming together. The last thing that I have to stitch is up the toe seam, and I'll just do that fast whip stitch again that I did at the heel. So be back in a few minutes. Here's the shoe. I think it looks great. I think at the heel, it's probably I cut a little too low. I look forward to making real shoes with this technique, and I hope that you do too. I would appreciate it if you would like my video and perhaps subscribe to my channel. I'll be coming back with making a felt shoe using the same technique, but having made the initial mock-up over a real human's foot.